life's very Lord, God's darling one, Mary's own babe, so cold and so...
Hello. This is the talk, Catholic Respect Life and the Death Penalty. And I am known in the prisons as Brother Dale. So I always like to start out making sure that all of you know I'm not a religious brother. I am not a deacon. I am simply a long-term lay volunteer in prison ministry here in Florida for the Catholic Church. And for the last 22 years, have been at death row in Rayford and Stark with the men facing execution and the men actually in the death house under an active death warrant. So many of you may not know that my original journey with Respect Life started in the late 60s and early 70s in Cincinnati, where I was trained by Dr. Wilkie and his wife to speak on the subject of right to life with respect to abortion and euthanasia and assisted suicide to high school and college students in the tri-state area. But now here I am speaking with you about Respect Life and the death penalty. It's wonderful to be here with you. Ever since I was first asked to be a part of this statewide Respect Life meeting, I have been looking forward to being with all of you in Palm Beach. So Bishop Barbarito, Miss Deanne, Deacon Greg, thank you so much for including me in this important event. When we first started planning for this, we didn't have the COVID issue yet, but now we do. So I look forward to renewing our long friendships when it's possible to be together in person, hopefully soon. And Bishop Estevez, our Episcopal Moderator, thank you for your participation and encouragement and for your significant pastoral letter on capital punishment in Florida. I will be referring to that, and the links for it online are in all of your handouts. As Catholic Christians positioned in the opening throes of the third millennium, we are first and foremost a bulwark in defense of the God-given dignity of every human life, the God-given value of every human life. We are the guardians of the culture of life. We have to be, because we find ourselves and this faith stance under constant pressure and assault from the culture of death. Our active resistance to procured human abortion, both in principle and by active engagement in efforts to assist mothers with the resources and the means to bring their unborn children to birth healthfully and hopefully, has been a first front in our battle to defend the culture of life. But as all of us know, there are additional fronts. U.S. Supreme Court Justice Neil Gorsuch has penned an authoritative tome on the current status of the legal and philosophical arguments against legalizing assisted suicide and euthanasia. Ultimately, outlining an argument for retaining current laws banning assisted suicide and euthanasia. An argument that has received relatively little attention in the American debate. It is an argument premised on the idea that all human beings are intrinsically valuable, and the intentional taking of human life by private persons is always wrong. This does beg the question, however, what about the same taking of human life done by government? What about executions? Back in the late 60s and early 1970s, when I was newly involved in the Right to Life movement, I did not even consider capital punishment to be a Catholic life issue. Based upon the writings and guidance of our U.S. bishops at that time, our Catholic Church did consider capital punishment to be a Catholic life issue. Unfortunately, I was not well informed. Fortunately, in our time, now, we have a wealth of information from our church to inform us that capital punishment is indeed a respect life issue. And here in Florida, the Catholic bishops have given us tremendous guidance on this issue. As I mentioned, our Episcopal Moderator for Respect Life, Bishop Estevez, has recently released a profound pastoral letter on the subject, standing up for the dignity of all human life, a pastoral letter on capital punishment in Florida. He works from the words and teaching of the greatest church authorities in our age, St. John Paul II, Emeritus Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis, saying, Pope Francis has now revised paragraph 2267 of the Catholic Catechism. His thinking is that today capital punishment is unacceptable, however serious the condemned crime may have been. The death penalty, regardless of the means of execution, entails cruel, inhumane, and degrading treatment. Furthermore, it is to be rejected due to the defective selectivity of the criminal justice system and in the face of the possibility of judicial error. And of course, there he's referring to the risk of executing the innocent, which we're going to get to in a minute. The actual revision to the Catechism of the Catholic Church reads as follows at paragraph 2267. Recourse to the death penalty on the part of legitimate authority following a fair trial was long considered an appropriate response to the gravity of certain crimes and an acceptable, albeit extreme, means of safeguarding the common good. The paragraph in the Catechism continues, there is an increasing awareness that the dignity of the person is not lost, even after the commission of very serious crimes. In addition, a new understanding has emerged of the significance of penal sections imposed by the state. Lastly, more effective systems of detention have been developed, which ensure the due protection of citizens, but at the same time, do not definitively deprive the guilty of the possibility of redemption. Consequently, the Church teaches, in the light of the gospel, that the death penalty is inadmissible because it is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the person. And she works with determination for its abolition worldwide. The teaching of the Catholic Church is clear. So why do so many of us Respect Life Catholics not yet know that capital punishment is a Respect Life issue? The fact that this question stymies so many of us speaks loudly to the reality that most of us are unaware of another critical historical fact. That is that U.S. abortion law and the modern U.S. death penalty are Irish twins. Both were birthed from the same U.S. Supreme Court, same 9 justices, less than a year apart. It is rare to meet anyone in the Catholic Respect Life movement in Florida who knows that the constitutional parameters governing abortion and those for the modern American death penalty were both conceived and birthed by the exact same U.S. Supreme Court. Without regard to the fact that the unborn child is a human person from the moment of conception, those 9 justices fashioned a sliding scale of abortion rights based upon trimesters of the pregnancy. They resorted to procedures to avoid facing the foundational issue of a human being's right to life. Those same 9 justices with the very same court also decided that the death penalty could be constitutional in the U.S. if it met a labyrinth of procedural factors. They created an insane juridical contraption that is still arbitrary, capricious, and racially biased. In short, just as they did with the right to life in abortion, they resorted to procedures to avoid facing the foundational issue of the right to life of a human being. Florida's Respect Life Catholics are outraged at the 1972-75 Burger Court for the hocus pocus it used to justify Roe v. Wade. And we must also be outraged at the same hokum from the very same court that was spun in the mirage of constitutional procedures that would justify continued use of the death penalty. We also have to address some very popular myths that are touted by pro-death advocates and politicians. Primarily, and first and foremost, the myth of cost effectiveness. One of the most consistent and pervasive myths about the Florida death penalty is that it's cheaper than life in prison. Nothing could be further from the truth. A critical part of perpetuating that myth is the notion that if we just execute people quickly, it would be cheaper than putting them in prison. The problem is that even with our existing system of appeals, we do not have a good record for putting only guilty people on death row. Next is the myth of deterrence. According to the Death Penalty Information Center in Washington, D.C., this is probably the most common justification given for the death penalty. The essence of the theory is that the threat of being executed at some time in the future will be sufficient to cause a significant number of people to refrain from committing a heinous crime that they had otherwise planned. Whether the death penalty is a proven method of lowering the murder rate has been subjected to many studies over many decades. The National Academy of Sciences has concluded that past studies have failed to prove or disprove a deterrent effect by capital punishment. It's just not real. Next is the myth that lethal injection is painless and humane. This is simply not true. Even if everything in the execution procedure goes by the book, there is significant concern that the process of chemically inducing conscious suffocation is neither painless nor humane. For example, the post-execution autopsies conducted after a recent slate of federal lethal injections suggests to a, quote, virtual medical certainty, close quote, that federal death row prisoners experience excruciating pain while they are being put to death by lethal injection with pentobarbital. And the killing drugs used by the states have their own litany of horror. A recently released investigation into post-lethal injection autopsy reports in the state of Georgia was so disturbing that executions held in Georgia, Arkansas, Missouri, Tennessee, and Ohio are also being challenged. The issue is pulmonary edema, which has been shown in autopsies in 84% of the cases, and spans the different states and the different chemical cocktails employed to kill the inmates. And all that horror was when the lethal injection was done by the book without mishap. What about when the lethal injection is botched? The transcript of my sworn testimony given in an Ocala Circuit Court concerning what I actually witnessed in Florida's botched lethal injection of Angel Diaz in December of 2006 is available on the internet and in my second book, Now I Walk on Death Row. For years in my death penalty talks in Florida, I have said, the fact of the matter is there is no nice way to kill people. Now I prefer the way Pope Francis says it. However administered, the death penalty is an attack on the inviolability and dignity of the human person. And we also must deal with the myth that capital punishment is racially neutral. In our U.S. history, this myth has never been true, and it is not true now. After 5 years of extensive research and writing to produce my first book, The Biblical Truth About America's Death Penalty, I was able to say authoritatively, in places where executions are prevalent today, Extrajudicial lynchings used to be quite common. Lynchings, of course, were often racially motivated. The racially biased process of lynchings laid the foundation for a racially biased death penalty. The death penalty is a direct descendant of lynching and other forms of racial violence and racial oppression in America. I summarized over 100 pages of text in that chapter on racial discrimination in the U.S. death penalty, saying, in a word, when it comes to racial bias and the death penalty, America is stuck. The death penalty remains, as it always has throughout our history, a matter of race. As detailed in your handouts, U.S. executions are a regional aberration. 86% of the 1,516 state-level U.S. executions in the last 44 years, from 1976 through September 15, 2020, have occurred in the Bible Belt. The area of the U.S. consisting of the 11 states and territory, Oklahoma, of the Confederacy, and the slaveholding border states. The use of the death penalty in the United States is heavily localized in the Bible Belt. An application of the death penalty to crimes of murder continues to be heavily influenced by race. In general, people of color continue to be overrepresented on America's death rows. For example, while only 12% of Florida's population is African American, 37% of its death row is African American. Then there's the myth that the death penalty provides closure to the families of the murder victims. Some proponents of capital punishment have long argued for the death penalty on the grounds that it brings closure to family members of homicide victims. But science suggests that achieving closure through execution may be a myth, and that capital punishment may actually make matters worse. Studies quoted in Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin and the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology show that the death penalty, quote, keeps victims involved in the tragedy for years, even decades, as multiple appeals and hearings and trials drag on, close quote. And because our justice system is so prone to error, speeding up executions does not offer hope of healing for families of murder victims. It only promises more trauma for them and for families of the wrongfully accused as the innocent face execution for crimes they did not commit. And that brings us smack up against another major myth of the U.S. death penalty and the Florida death penalty, which is the myth of error-free justice. One would think with all those appellate reviews, our system should be virtually error-free when it comes to convicting and sentencing people to death. Nothing could be further from the truth. The death penalty carries the inherent risk of executing an innocent person. Since 1973, more than 170 people who had been wrongfully convicted and sentenced to death in the U.S. have been exonerated. Here in Florida, over that same time period, 30 people have been exonerated and released from our death row, more than any other jurisdiction. The final myth I would like to identify and touch upon is a peculiarly Catholic one. In Catholic moral theology, we have the term intrinsically evil. An act that is intrinsically evil is one that cannot be justified morally by any attendant facts. This standard is applied to procured abortion. A frequent claim made in American Catholic mass media is the myth that, unlike procured abortion, the death penalty is never intrinsically evil. That is a myth that is not true, at least not according to the greatest theologian of the Catholic West in the last 1,000 years. In his masterpiece of integration of Western theology and philosophy, the Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas stated clearly and point blank that the execution of an innocent person is intrinsically evil. I have witnessed the execution of a person I was absolutely convinced was innocent. Let us hold up next to the warning from two Catholic pro-death penalty U.S. Supreme Court justices, Scalia and Thomas, who warned us that the only way to guarantee our error-prone criminal justice system would not execute an innocent person is to scrap the death penalty. Let us hold that warning up against the statement of St. Thomas Aquinas that the execution of an innocent person is intrinsically evil. I believe all us pro-life Catholics in Florida have our marching orders. We need to end the use of the death penalty and the use of abortion in the Sunshine State. That is our mission, that is our call, and that is at the core of our stand for Respect Life. Thank you.
O sacred head surrounded by crown of piercing thorns.
I'd like to start talking about one woman who did respect life, and her choice has made a difference in the life of virtually every person on this planet. Her name was Joanne Scheibel. In 1954, she was a young, unmarried college student who discovered that she was pregnant. In the 1950s, her options were limited. She could have an abortion, but the procedure was both dangerous and illegal. She could have gotten married, but she wasn't ready and didn't want to interrupt her education. So Joanne opted instead to give birth to the baby and put it up for adoption. So in 1955, a California couple by the name of Paul and Clara Jobs adopted a baby boy born out of wedlock. They named that boy Stephen. Today we know him as Stephen Jobs. It would not be overstating to say that Steve Jobs, who passed away of neuroendocrine cancer 9 years ago on October 5th, was this past century's Thomas Edison. As one observer put it, he knew what the world wanted before the world knew that it wanted it. You ever used an iPhone or an iPad or anything remotely resembling them, you can thank Steve Jobs. Your world has been transformed by the ability to hear a symphony, send a letter, pay a bill, deposit a check, read a book, and then buy theater tickets on something smaller than a deck of cards. You can thank Steve Jobs. You can also thank Joanne Scheibel. If you want to know how much one life can matter, this is just one example. But imagine if that life never happened. Imagine if an unmarried pregnant college student 65 years ago had made a different choice. Now imagine all the unmarried pregnant college students who make that different choice today. By one measure, more than half of all abortions in the United States, approximately 53%, occur in young women under the age of 25. That is hundreds of thousands of lives every year, snuffed out, millions over the past quarter century. The horrifying truth is this: we live now in a culture that not only does not respect life, but discards it like trash. Not only at the beginning of life, but also at the end, and every place in between. What has happened to us? Now, in Europe, there's an industry called suicide tourism. It's for people who are old and infirm and they want to kill themselves. I remember the last presidential race at a presidential rally in California. It was announced during that rally that 234 people had been executed in Texas. When they said that, hundreds of people in that crowd just applauded. So again, I ask, what has happened to us? Well, Catholics can disagree about whether the death penalty is necessary, but we can't disagree about this. Cheering death, any death, especially if it involves someone who may be innocent, is an affront to life. And yet we do it so easily. And that's part of the problem. Life has become disposable. I recall reading in the New York Times a couple of years ago that this practice that was called singleton. This practice of singleton is where pregnant women with triplets or twins can arrange to have one or more of their babies aborted to better manage the size of their family. Now, we don't talk about it often, but it needs to be said. The reason we don't see as many children anymore with Down syndrome isn't because of some great medical breakthrough. No, it's because roughly 90% of them are being aborted. So I ask again, what has happened to us? The gospel passage that we had this past Respect Life Sunday, that first Sunday of October, in one sense is about respecting life, and the other about choosing death. It brings us that familiar saying about the stone that the builder rejected. Well, you and I, we have rejected more stones, more lives than we can count. When will it end? It's increasingly clear that the only lasting change that will happen when we work to change not only laws, but also our hearts. And that begins with each and every one of us. When will it end? This nightmare will end when we pass on what we all know to be true. For all of its complexity and complications, all of its sorrows and fears, its headaches, its heartaches, life matters. Every life, at every moment. This nightmare will end when we teach our children that nothing and no one is ever discarded. Recall that story in the Gospels of the multiplication of the loaves and fish. And when Christ performed that miracle, the story didn't end when everyone ate. It ended with the people gathering up every crumb, because every crumb was part of that miracle. No one, no thing, no life is wasted in the incredible work of God. This nightmare will end when we acknowledge that life is inconvenient and difficult and unplanned. But nothing and no one is ever unplanned or unwanted when the one doing the planning and the wanting is God. This nightmare will end when we realize at last that love is greater than fear. It will end when we make of our lives a continuing prayer, a prayer that isn't afraid to plead, to ask, to question, to hope. Prayer that embraces the beautiful truth of the most popular prayer in the world. Thy will be done. Prayer that is able to trust. It will end when we see life not as a problem to be solved, but as a gift to be embraced. It will end when we simply choose life, beautiful, chaotic, unpredictable, explosive, crazy life. Life isn't something to be discarded because it is difficult or inconvenient or unexpected or old or sick. It is so much greater than we realize. I often mention in baptisms that I perform that the baptism rite begins with declaring the name of the child. The priest asks the parents, "What name have you given this child?" Now, that practice harkens all the way back to the book of Genesis. And the first thing Adam did after God created him, he named everything around him. With that, man continued God's creative work in the world. We do that today with every life that we welcome. God continues his creation. Choosing life, we choose to be part of that. That's precisely what Joanne Scheibel did. Think of her the next time you make a phone call or plug in your iPad or download music. Now, at this conference, consider the work before us. It begins here and now. By changing how we talk about life, how we treat life, how we teach life to our children, we will begin to change hearts, to change minds. Respect life is more than just a catchphrase. It needs to be a way of living. Respect life, not just in the womb, but everywhere, at every time, in all circumstances, with our families, our communities, the places we work, places that we do business. It means treating every life with dignity and honoring every life as a gift. Doing that moment by moment, we will begin to change the culture. And heart by heart, you and I will begin to change the world.